What does it feel like to carry a weapon that terrifies everyone, including yourself? 70 pounds of fuel and fire strapped to your back. Knowing that one bullet in the wrong place will turn you into a human torch. Knowing that the enemy fears you so much they'll target you first in any engagement. When you're surrounded in the darkness on Okinawa, when Japanese soldiers are emerging from caves all around your position, when conventional weapons can't reach the enemy hidden in underground positions and your platoon is seconds away from being overrun. What goes through your mind as you squeeze the trigger on a flamethrower and transform night into day, darkness into fire, certain death into desperate survival? I'm 95 years old, and in May 1945 I was a 20-year-old Marine carrying an M2A17 flamethrower through some of the most brutal combat of the Pacific War, wielding a weapon that could clear caves and bunkers in seconds, but that also made me the most vulnerable man in my platoon, learning that sometimes the most terrifying weapon becomes the only thing standing between survival and annihilation. This is the story of one night on Okinawa, when a flamethrower turned darkness into survival, when fire became salvation, when the weapon I'd feared carrying became the tool that saved 40 Marines from being slaughtered in the dark. My name is Joseph Anthony Caruso, and I was a private first class in the United States Marine Corps, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, 1st Marine Division, fighting on Okinawa in the spring of 1945 during the largest and bloodiest battle of the Pacific Campaign. I'd enlisted in 1943, had fought on Peleliu in September 1944, had survived that nightmare island, and had been promoted and assigned as a flamethrower operator for the Okinawa campaign. The assignment came without much choice. The previous flamethrower operator had been killed on Peleliu, and the company needed someone to carry the weapon, and I'd shown aptitude for staying calm under fire, which apparently qualified me for one of the most dangerous jobs in the infantry. The M2A17 flamethrower was a backpack-mounted weapon system that weighed about 70 pounds fully loaded, consisted of 2 fuel tanks and a compressed nitrogen propellant tank, had an effective range of about 40 yards, and could fire for about 10 seconds total before the fuel was exhausted. It was designed to clear fortified positions, to reach into bunkers and caves where explosives couldn't penetrate, to create psychological terror that conventional weapons couldn't match. The weapon worked by propelling napalm-thickened fuel through a nozzle and igniting it, creating a stream of fire that could reach into enclosed spaces, consume oxygen, and kill through heat and asphyxiation, even when the flames didn't directly touch the target. But carrying a flamethrower made you a priority target. Enemy soldiers recognized the distinctive silhouette and understood the threat, would concentrate fire on you to eliminate the weapon before it could be used. The fuel tanks were pressurized, but theoretically wouldn't explode from small arms fire. But nobody fully trusted that theory, and we all knew that if the tanks were penetrated, the fuel could ignite and turn the operator into a human torch. Flamethrower operators had extremely high casualty rates, most didn't survive more than a few missions, and everyone knew that accepting the weapon was accepting significantly reduced odds of survival. I'd carried the flamethrower through several weeks of combat on Okinawa, had used it dozens of times to clear caves and bunkers, had seen what it could do, and had developed a professional relationship with the weapon despite fearing it. The key to surviving as a flamethrower operator was to never be predictable, to move constantly, to use the weapon quickly and then relocate before enemy fire could find you, to have covering fire from your squad that would suppress enemy positions while you maneuvered into range. My squad had learned to work with me, understood how to support the flamethrower, and we'd developed tactics that maximized the weapon's effectiveness while minimizing my exposure. By mid-May 1945, we'd been fighting on Okinawa for over a month, had advanced through some of the most heavily fortified terrain in the Pacific, had taken casualties that reduced our company to about 60% of its authorized strength. The Japanese were defending every yard of ground, using the island's natural cave systems and the fortifications they'd built over months of preparation to create defensive positions that were almost impossible to overcome with conventional infantry tactics. They'd retreat into caves during artillery bombardments, emerge to fight when American infantry advanced, disappear back underground when pressure became too great, creating a grinding battle of attrition that favored the defenders. On the night of May 14, 1945, my platoon was holding a position we'd captured earlier in the day, a ridgeline that gave us tactical advantage, but that was surrounded by caves and underground positions that we hadn't fully cleared. The area was honeycombed with tunnels and chambers, many of them interconnected, creating a three-dimensional battlefield where the enemy could appear anywhere at any time. We'd established a perimeter, dug fighting holes, positioned machine guns to cover approaches, but the reality was that we were sitting on top of a Japanese defensive complex, and we hadn't neutralized all the threats below us. Lieutenant Morrison, our platoon commander, had wanted to withdraw to a more defensible position for the night, but battalion had ordered us to hold because the ridge was important for the next day's advance. So we settled in, maintained full alert, expected that the Japanese would probe our positions during the night or launch a counterattack to retake the ridge. Standard procedure for night defensive positions in the Pacific: stay alert, conserve ammunition, don't fire unless you have a clear target because muzzle flashes give away your position. I was in a fighting hole near the center of our perimeter. My flamethrower positioned where I could reach it quickly but not so close that it would be in the way or at risk from stray fire. Corporal Eddie Thompson from Alabama was sharing my hole, serving as my assistant and providing rifle fire while I operated the flamethrower. We'd worked together for weeks, had developed the kind of trust that keeps you alive in combat, and I was as comfortable as you can be in a fighting hole on Okinawa waiting for whatever the night would bring. The attack came around 0200 hours, emerging not from approaches we could see but from caves within our perimeter. Japanese soldiers using underground tunnels to position themselves literally underneath us, and then erupting into our positions from multiple directions simultaneously. The first indication was grenades. Japanese grenades being thrown from cave entrances we hadn't identified. Explosions within our perimeter that killed and wounded Marines before anyone could react. Then rifle fire from multiple points. Muzzle flashes revealing positions that shouldn't have existed. Chaos as we tried to respond to threats that were coming from everywhere at once. Thompson and I were firing at muzzle flashes trying to identify targets in the darkness, but the situation was deteriorating rapidly. Japanese soldiers were overrunning fighting holes, engaging Marines in hand-to-hand combat, creating complete disorder in our defensive perimeter. I could hear Lieutenant Morrison trying to coordinate a response, trying to establish what was happening and where the threats were coming from, but the confusion was total, and our carefully prepared defense had dissolved into scattered individuals fighting for survival. I realized that conventional weapons weren't going to win this fight, that rifles and machine guns couldn't reach into the caves where the Japanese were emerging from, that we needed something that could seal those cave entrances and stop the flow of enemy soldiers into our perimeter. I grabbed the flamethrower, strapped it on despite Thompson yelling that using it at night would make me a target that every Japanese soldier in the area would see. But we were already being overrun, and I'd rather die trying to fight back than die passively waiting for the inevitable. I moved toward the nearest cave entrance, maybe 30 yards from my position, a dark opening in the hillside where I could see muzzle flashes as Japanese soldiers fired from protected positions. Thompson provided covering fire, his M1 Garand cracking in the darkness trying to suppress the enemy fire long enough for me to get into range. I could feel bullets passing close, could hear them hitting the ground around me, knew that I was the most visible target on the battlefield because I was moving while everyone else was hunkered down. But I kept going because stopping meant dying, and forward was the only direction that mattered. I reached effective range, maybe 25 yards from the cave entrance, dropped to one knee to stabilize, aimed the nozzle, and squeezed the trigger. The flamethrower roared to life, a stream of burning fuel that arced through the darkness and into the cave entrance, transforming night into day, creating a wall of fire that filled the cave mouth and reached back into the tunnel system behind it. The effect was immediate and devastating. Japanese soldiers in the cave were caught by the flames, killed instantly, or forced deeper into the tunnels, and the flow of enemy soldiers from that entrance stopped completely. But firing the flamethrower had revealed my position to every Japanese soldier in the area, and immediately I was taking concentrated fire from multiple directions. Thompson was still providing covering fire, but I needed to move. Staying in one place meant dying, so I displaced to another position and looked for the next cave entrance that needed to be sealed. I could see them now, lit by the fires from the first cave I'd hit. Multiple openings in the hillside where Japanese soldiers were emerging. Maybe 5 or 6 entrances within the area our platoon was defending. I moved to the second cave entrance, took fire the entire way, felt at least one round impact my flamethrower tank but penetrate without igniting the fuel, reached firing position, and sent another stream of fire into the opening. Again the transformation. Darkness into fire, the cave sealed, enemy soldiers either killed or driven back. But I'd used maybe 4 seconds of fuel, had maybe 6 seconds left total, and there were still multiple cave entrances active and Japanese soldiers still pouring into our perimeter. I had to make every second count, had to prioritize which caves to hit and which to leave for conventional weapons to deal with. I moved to a third entrance, the largest one I could see, sent 3 seconds of fire into it, the longest burst I'd used, making sure the flames reached deep into the tunnel system. The fire consumption was enormous. The cave entrance became an inferno and I'd probably killed dozens of Japanese soldiers with that one burst, but I'd also exhausted my fuel. The flamethrower was empty, reduced to 70 pounds of dead weight strapped to my back. But the effect on the battlefield had been transformative. The 3 caves I'd sealed had been the primary entry points for the Japanese attack. Stopping the flow from those entrances had stopped the counterattack's momentum, given our Marines time to reorganize and establish a coherent defense. The Japanese soldiers already in our perimeter were cut off from reinforcement, were being systematically killed or driven back by Marine riflemen who'd regained their composure and were fighting with the discipline that training had instilled. The battle was turning, the crisis was passing, and it was primarily because the flamethrower had sealed the caves that were feeding the attack. I dropped the empty flamethrower, took up my rifle, joined the defense as a rifleman, fought through the rest of the night as we cleared the remaining Japanese from our perimeter and secured the position. By dawn, the counterattack had been completely defeated. We'd held the ridge, but we'd taken significant casualties, 15 Marines killed and 20 wounded out of the 40-man platoon. Losses we couldn't easily replace, but that would have been far worse if the flamethrower hadn't stopped the attack when it did. Lieutenant Morrison found me at first light, looked at the burned-out caves, looked at me, and said something I'll never forget. "Caruso, you saved this platoon. If you hadn't sealed those caves when you did, we'd have been overrun completely, killed or captured to the last man. You did something tonight that I've never seen before. Used a flamethrower at night under conditions where everyone said it was suicide, and you not only survived, but you changed the outcome of the battle. I'm recommending you for the Silver Star, and you've earned every bit of it." I was too exhausted to respond properly, just nodded and sat down, the adrenaline draining and leaving me shaking and aware of how close I'd come to dying. Thompson came over, put his hand on my shoulder, said he'd never seen anything braver or crazier than watching me charge toward those caves with a flamethrower, while taking fire from every direction. I told him it hadn't felt brave, had felt like the only option available, that using the flamethrower was less scary than sitting in a hole waiting to be overrun. Over the following days, as we continued fighting on Okinawa, the story of that night spread through the battalion, was retold with embellishments that made it more dramatic than it had been, though the reality was dramatic enough. I became known as the Marine who'd used a flamethrower at night to stop a counterattack, earned respect from men who'd previously avoided me, because carrying a flamethrower marked you as someone who probably wouldn't survive long enough to be worth knowing. The weapon I'd feared, that had made me a target, that had seemed like a death sentence when I was first assigned to carry it, had become the tool that defined my service and saved my platoon. But I also carried the weight of what I'd done, the knowledge of how many men I'd killed with that weapon, the understanding that burning people to death is among the most terrible ways to kill. The flamethrower was effective because it was horrifying, created death through fire and heat and oxygen deprivation that was torturous even by the standards of combat. I'd killed dozens of Japanese soldiers that night, had heard their screams as the flames consumed them, had seen the aftermath when we cleared the caves and found the burned bodies. The tactical necessity didn't erase the moral weight. The knowledge that I'd inflicted terrible deaths on men who were following their own code of honor and defending their territory from foreign invasion. These questions haunted me for decades after the war, contributed to nightmares and guilt that characterized my post-war years, made it difficult to reconcile my role as a Marine defending his brothers with my role as a human being who'd killed other human beings in particularly terrible ways. The flamethrower had saved my platoon, that was indisputable fact, but it had done so through methods that raised moral questions I couldn't easily answer. The Battle of Okinawa continued through June 1945, the bloodiest campaign of the Pacific War, resulting in over 12,000 American deaths and 38,000 wounded, with Japanese casualties estimated at over 100,000 military and civilian deaths. My battalion fought through the entire campaign, took casualties that reduced us to a fraction of our original strength, survived through combination of training and will, and the mutual support that kept Marines functioning when individual courage would have failed. I carried the flamethrower through the rest of the campaign, used it dozens more times, survived when most flamethrower operators didn't, came home in late 1945 after the Japanese surrender. I struggled to adjust to civilian life. The transition from combat to peacetime was difficult for many veterans, but particularly hard for those of us who'd used weapons like the flamethrower that created moral complexity beyond normal combat. I used the GI Bill to attend college, became a high school history teacher, married and raised 3 children, built a successful normal life. But the flamethrower and Okinawa and that night in May 1945 remained central to how I understood myself and my war service, experiences that shaped everything that came after. I'm 95 years old now, one of the last surviving Marines from Okinawa, one of the few who can bear witness to what happened on that island and what it cost to take it. The flamethrower is long gone, probably scrapped or destroyed shortly after the war ended, exists now only in museums and in the memories of the few men who carried them in combat. But its legacy lives in the Marines who survived because I used it that night, in the families they raised and the contributions they made to society, in the ripple effects that extend through generations. The question I've pondered for 78 years is whether using the flamethrower was morally justified, whether the terrible deaths I inflicted could be balanced against the lives I saved, whether the ends justified the means in the most literal sense. The tactical answer is clear. The flamethrower was necessary, was the only weapon that could seal those caves and stop the counterattack, saved American lives at the cost of Japanese lives. The strategic answer is equally clear. Okinawa had to be taken to end the war. Flamethrowers were essential tools for overcoming Japanese defensive tactics. The casualties inflicted were regrettable but necessary. But the personal answer is more complicated. I killed men in terrible ways, heard their screams, saw the aftermath. Carry that weight still. The necessity doesn't erase the moral complexity. The tactical justification doesn't resolve the human cost. I did what I believed was right, what my training and duty required, what the situation demanded. But right and necessary don't always align, and living with the consequences of actions taken in extremity has been the work of a lifetime. If this story moved you, if it helped you understand what Marines endured on Okinawa and the moral complexity of combat and the terrible choices that war forces on young men, I'd be honored if you'd subscribe to hear more stories from World War II veterans. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Remember the Marines who fought on Okinawa, who used terrible weapons to accomplish necessary missions, who survived through courage and sacrifice and mutual support. Remember that war creates moral complexity that doesn't resolve with victory, that the tools of survival sometimes carry costs that last lifetimes. Thank you for listening to this old Marine's memories of the night a flamethrower turned darkness into survival, and the price paid for that survival by all involved.